All right, picking up where we left off, we're going to start to talk about fonts and how you can style them. So let's take a look at what we've got so far. All right, this is where we are so far. You can see that this is using some generic sans serif. It's probably Times New Roman. And it's black. And you'll notice that this link over here that says, it's hard to read, but it says starting at $130 is in blue underline, right? So these are some default behaviors, default styles that the browser is going to automatically display if you don't style stuff, right? It's if you don't tell a font what to be, then it's going to be a serif Times New Roman or something like it, right? And links are going to be underlined in blue and or purple if you've already been there, right? So the other thing you'll notice too, for instance, is like the headings are by default already heavier than the paragraph text. I didn't style it that way. That is what's referred to the default browser style sheet. And so we have to style it specifically if we want it to look different. So let's talk a little bit about the safe font list. So in web design, I'm going to jump really quickly over to a web page that I pulled up, and you can do a search for it just by typing in WebSafe Fonts. The other thing is you could just go to w3schools.com and you can just come to this website. It's right here on this page. Anyway, these WebSafe font combinations, or not combinations, just WebSafe fonts, are the only fonts that are going to be truly safe for you to use without doing some kind of special font loading up front, meaning that Macs and Windows computers will all have this. And so they all have Georgia, they all have Palatino, they all have Times New Roman or Times, they all have Arial. These are the sans serif fonts. And if you don't know serif from sans serif, you can pay attention to the way that the type looks here. So for instance, this T, you'll see that it has these little, they're called serifs, these little embellishments on the ends. I call them dippy-doos, flippy-doos sometimes. Anyway, each one of these serif fonts has a serif on the end of the letter forms, and these are traditionally easier to read in print, but not on the screen. And so serif fonts, you'll notice, don't have them. They end in like straight letter forms. All right, they don't have the serifs or flippy-doos or embellishments at the ends. Okay, anyway, so those are just general classes. There also is another class called monospace font. Monospace means that each letter takes up the same amount of proportional space in the width for each character. And those are terrible for normal design, but they're good for coding, all right, so that you can see where a space is actually a space. Anyway, so for serifs, Georgia, Palatino, and Times, those are web safe without you having to do any kind of special font loading. Arial Black, Comic Sans, Impact, Lucida Sans, Unicode, and basically the Lucida family is pretty safe. Tahoma, Trebuchet, and Verdana. These are going to be web-safe fonts, meaning that if I just come over here and I give a font designation, for instance, if I come over here to where it says body, I've already started writing my body selector. I could type font-family, right, and then I could tell it to be Arial, like that, and see automatically it changes. This is a web-safe font. And I would do what's called a fallback. I put a comma and then I put sans serif, so that if some reason, for some crazy reason, a computer doesn't have Arial, there's probably something wrong with it if it doesn't. But if it doesn't have Arial, then it will use whatever the default sans serif is designated for that computer. So now the thing is, I could put a lot of different fonts in here. I could put like Helvetica, for instance, because I'm on a Mac. Helvetica actually comes on Macs, but it doesn't come on Windows computers. And so Helvetica won't show up properly. It would default to some other sans serif as the fallback if it's provided. If you don't have a fallback provided, then it's still going to look like Times New Roman, right? So these are things that are really important to understand. So if you want to see the WebSafe font list, you can come back over here and take a look at the ones that you can use. And I would only use the ones that are the leading ones, like Helvetica, for instance, is not WebSafe. It's not. It's showing you, just so you understand, it's showing you the first font choice, and then it's showing you some fallback options. Helvetica would be a fallback, I guess, in this case for Arial, although Helvetica is a much nicer font. Realistically, somebody would probably load Helvetica, then Arial, then sans serif. But anyway, just look at the ones that are listed first so that you can see you know, which ones are the safe ones, okay? There are some other places that you can grab WebSafe font lists as well. Now, that being said, we're not going to be using WebSafe fonts. We're going to be using Google Fonts. And what you can do, basically, the reason something is WebSafe is if somebody doesn't have that font on their computer, right, and that's what you specify that they use, then it's going to say, well, I don't have that, I'm going to use something else. And if you don't tell it what to substitute that they do have, like Arial or sans serif or something like that, then what it will do is it will go and just randomly pick some other default font. And that can really not only mess up your design because it's an inappropriate font, but maybe it's hard to read, or you know, maybe it really doesn't go at all with your design. There can be lots of reasons. And the other thing too is different fonts take up different amounts of space, and so you might be planning on using a font that has, you know, like sort of an open typeface that you know, that's not condensed, for instance, and so it takes up a lot of room, and you're planning for that. Whereas, you know, maybe you've got something that's going to take up a lot less room, right? And that's going to end up being the default, and you don't want that to happen because it could look bad. Anyway, so let's look at how you can load fonts. There's some different ways. If you're in CodePen, one of the easy ways to do some font testing with different stuff is you can go here to Assets. And if you go over to Fonts, it gives you some options for really basic fonts that are really commonly used all the time, but there are hundreds and hundreds of Google Fonts. And so it gives you a link right here to go to Google Fonts. But if we wanted to just get started, for instance, with what is here, let's say that we want Montserrat, and so I can click on that and I can say I want to copy at import, copy link, copy font family. You don't know what this means probably right now. So there are some different ways that you can import your fonts into the into your documents. We're going to use right now copy, or excuse me, we're going to be using the at import method. So where it says copy at import, just click on that and it says copied to clipboard up here. And then I'll close this up. And I'm going to go ahead at the very top of my CSS before anything else. I'm going to paste that right there. And what it's doing is it's automatically going to Google Font. It's loading the Google Font API and it's pulling in the Montserrat family options. And what this means is that it's going to give us the normal weight of 400, 400 italics, and 700, which is going to be a bold font, right? So one of the things too that I'll go ahead and tell you right now is traditionally the number 400 is also the equivalent to what is referred to as the normal weight, right? So if you don't tell something to have a bold or an italic or whatever, it will want to order, it'll load the normal weight, which is traditionally 400 for most fonts. If I wanted to be able to italicize something, I have to have this particular font's 400 italics. If a font actually has a special style in italics, then it needs to be loaded, otherwise your italics might not work on that font. It's interestingly. Now, bold is either usually in the 700 or 600 numeral range. All right, and so I'll talk a little bit about how you can designate that later, but I just want you to see that the way that this at import is structured is that it has at import, and then it's going to grab the URL, all right, or the address where it can get those fonts, and it's going to Google Font APIs, and right here, this question mark, it's a query mark, and it's saying, go to this address and find where the font family, basically the family is equal to Montserrat, and then where it says colon 400, 400i, and 700, it's loading all the different weights that we have accessible to us. And the more font weights that you load, the longer the load time potentially can be. This is going to be okay, but if you start loading like all of the styles for a font that you don't need all of them, then it's going to slow your load time for your page down. Okay. Okay, so I think that this one would be really good for headings. So if we go back there and take a look at that again, you'll see that Montserrat's kind of heavy looking. And I think that would make a great heading. Now, the other one that I want to use for the regular text is Open Sans. So I'll click on that and say copy at import. And I come back over here into my CSS. Here, let me close this up. I'll come back over here into my CSS and I'll paste it. Now you might look at this and go, wait, nothing has changed. That's fine, nothing has changed because this is just essentially loading it into our browser so that it can be used on this web page. All right. Now I actually would have to go in and designate what I want to have those different font designations. So what I would do, for instance, for body is I could say, all right, well, if I want the normal text of this particular page to basically be Open Sans, then I can come over here and I can change this. All right. And you might go, okay, well, how do I type that? Let me show you a little trick. If you go back down to Assets and you look where it says Open Sans, you'll click on this again. And where it says Copy Font Family, I can click on that. And let's just get rid of this whole thing in body. And then I can paste it. All right. And then what it's doing is it's saying font family, and then in quotes it puts Open Sans with a space in between. You couldn't have this without the quotation marks because it doesn't know what to do with this. It has to have those quote marks in order for this Open Sans to work. Okay, and you'll see that up here what it does, because it can't use a space in this particular URL, is that it uses a plus symbol. That's not what you're going to put down here in font family. You're going to put it as Open Space Sans inside of quotes. And then it uses just the regular fallback of sans serif. But if you wanted to be more specific, you could say, you know, that you wanted Arial to be the next fallback, and then just generic sans serif, for instance. You know, or if you know that, let's say that you think maybe some of your Mac users might want Helvetica, you could load Helvetica because Macs have that. Windows don't, so maybe you still want to keep Arial here. Helvetica and Arial are very similar, but Helvetica is just a little bit more sophisticated looking. Okay, so I could make my whole font family for the body be Open Sans. I just want my headings, however, to be in the Montserrat, right? So that's my font family here, and you see that now it's loaded up in Open Sans. It looks a little bit different. All right, so that's good. So let's go ahead and let's make our headings the actual font that we want them to be. So I'm going to come down below the body and I'm going to make something for H1, and then I'm going to tell it to be, and don't worry that this changed, it's because I have improper syntax. I don't have something that opens and closes here. So as soon as I finish writing this rule, this weird thing over here will correct itself. So I want to do this for, let's just start with the H1, okay, and I'm going to come back up here, and you can see that Montserrat is only one word. If it's only one word, then I know for a fact that I can just copy that and use it, and I don't have to have quotes if I don't want. So I'm going to say font-family like this, and then we're going to say Montserrat, and you see automatically it changed again for me, and we're going to go ahead and I'm going to say, hey, if it's not Montserrat, let's go ahead and use the rest of these fallbacks as well that we used for the rest of the page. Okay, and then this is what we've got. And then don't forget to terminate it. You have to terminate it. Okay, so now we've got Montserrat, and because Montserrat is one word, I don't have to put it in quotes, but it won't hurt anything if I do put it in quotes. All right, so that's totally fine. And make sure that you're not typing this like you're typing an English paper where the comma goes inside the quote, because otherwise that's not going to work. You have to put your quote and then the comma. Okay, that's important. And you don't have to have spaces here after the comma, but you can. You just can't have more than one space. You shouldn't have more than one space. Sometimes it won't matter in some browsers, but sometimes it will. Okay, so the next thing that I want to look at is, well, maybe I want all of my headings to be Montserrat. I think I do. I think I want where it says the hiking boot for all terrains and climates. I think I want that to also be Montserrat. So instead of making a whole brand new one for the font family, what I can do is just come up here where it says H1 in the selector, type a comma, and then I'll put a space. I don't have to have the space, but I'm going to have it because it's easier to read, with an H2. And then it applies it also to my H2. All right, this is what's referred to as a, I'll zoom in real quick. This right here is what's referred to as a grouped selector set. Okay, just so you have some understanding of that. It's a group selector set. Okay, so that means that all of my heading levels, H1 and H2, and if I had an H3, I could add that there too, but I don't, is going to be a font family of Montserrat. And then the rest of the font's going to be Open Sans. Okay, now the thing that we're missing though, oops, I didn't mean to do that, sorry about that. The thing that we're missing is, what about up here where it says be good to yourself? Well, that, remember I said that is not a heading, so it's not getting set out as the heading, but if you look here, we want it to be really big and dominant, right? So we need to also add this paragraph to that group of Montserrat, font families. Well, I don't want to just add any paragraph because this is also a paragraph and I don't want that paragraph to also be the same as the heading. So that's why this paragraph up here has an ID called callout. And so what we can do is we can specify that we want an ID to be a certain style here. So if I add to this grouped selector, I can add it where I put a hashtag and the word callout. A hashtag inside of your CSS is going to indicate an ID. And so it sees any instance of that ID called callout, and it will then apply this particular rule. All right, and the selector, that's why it's called a selector. It literally goes and it selects the instances that are going to be true in the HTML, and it applies the rules that are set out for that instance. Okay. All right, so if I add callout, you see that it actually changed up here. Now, as part of the group selector, I can't also, start telling them how big to be, because you'll notice in our example that the hierarchy is really different, right? And so I want where it says be good to yourself, I want it to be really big, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and start to make a new rule here, and I'm going to go ahead and, before I get too far, I want to show you something else too that is going to be true under the body, where I can come down to the next line. This is, before you go too far with anything else, you always want to make sure that you set up your base font size for the entire page, and you would do that typically, traditionally, in the body selector. So where you would say font dash size, all right, and you would tell it how big to be. Now, whenever you're setting the base size, the reason I say the base size is because fonts are one of those things where they are referred to as having accretive properties. An accretive property means that it's going to compound on itself. So if I tell something how big to be at the beginning, and then later, let's say that I go tell an H1 to be, larger than that, then it's going to be bigger based off of the base size. And so if I say right here, font size is, let's say, 16 pixels. All right, and the reason I'm choosing 16 pixels is because 16 pixels is the default standard size without telling it how big to be. That is also referred to, if I wanted to put this in some sort of comment, I could do a comment like this in CSS. This is the way a comment in CSS looks. It's a /* and then asterisk / and then whatever goes in between is going to be commented out. So I could comment something out and I could say equals 1em or 100%. Okay, it's all the same thing right there. So if I start in the body by saying font size is 16 pixels, it's also the same as saying that it equals 1em or or 100%. Now, the reason I might want to tell it to be a certain size in pixels is because pixels are an absolute unit of measure. A pixel is a pixel is a pixel, all right, because it's based on hardware resolution. And so an M, however, is based on the relative size of the relative width of the letter M in a font, okay? And 100% is going to be 100% of what? Well, if it's not designated, then it's going to be based off of this 16 pixel font size. All right, so let's just say that we're going to base it off of that. And then now let's come down here. I'll sort of use this as a point of reference. Now let's come down lower. After we've created our font family for the headings, let's come below and we'll tell the H. Well, actually, let's set the size of this callout before we do anything else, because that's going to end up determining a lot about where the rest of the things end up on the page. So let's come down here and we'll say hashtag callout. And by me typing this, it doesn't mean that I'm going to overwrite what's up here. The only way I would overwrite it is if I literally said font family again down here and gave it a different font, then it would overwrite it, because I'm using the same exact property name but giving it a different value. But if I just add other properties, then it's just going to add other properties, which is kind of cool. All right, so for the callout, I could say, let's just start, let's say maybe at 2M. All right, and the reason, oops, I actually have to say font size. Font dash size. Oops, it was right there at the top. Okay, and let's just see what happens at 2M. All right, and that's how big it gets. All right, that might be okay, maybe, I don't know. But let me just show you what happens if I go up here to the body and I tell it that I don't want it to start as the base of 16 pixels, but let's say that we want it to be 10 pixels. Look what happens. Everything got smaller. Everything, because I'm telling the font size, not just for this font family, whoops, sorry about that, not just for this font family in the body, but for all fonts. The font size, the base is going to be in the entire body 10 pixels now. And so that 2M is relative to the base size of that letter M, because the letter M just got smaller, right? So if I want this to be 20 pixels, then it's gigantic, right? So that's why sometimes it's just good to set it at the base size. If you want it to be a little bit larger than the traditional base size, you could bump it up to 17 pixels, for instance. All right, that's just to give you an idea, but let's just leave it at 16 pixels. And for the font size, let's say that the callout is actually going to be 3M. Let's see how that looks. I kind of like that because it really takes up a good part of the sky. It becomes more of a call to action. It, you know, to be good to yourself, and it gets your attention as to like, okay, why would you say that? Let's keep reading, right? And then you see this boot and it becomes clear that the boot is going to somehow enhance your life, right? And so if we come down, now we could make a decision. All right, well, what color should that be? Do we really want it to be black? Maybe it would be a good idea to think about, you know, color combinations. Orange and blue, in case you don't know much about color, orange and blue are complements of each other on the color wheel, meaning that they are directly across from each other on a color wheel, and orange and blue therefore are complementary colors. And so it just so happens that there's this perfect kind of color of orange down here inside this boot that might be really good. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it to have a color, this font size, or this callout, sorry. And the color right here, I don't know how to tell it to be orange. I could type the word orange, oops, orange, and it's going to give me an orange that I don't really like. That's not exactly the same orange. It's a little too red. It needs a little more yellow. I could come down here to assets and I could go over to colors and I could pick a color that I think is probably an appropriate color of orange. That looks like it might be pretty close. Let's see how that works. And we can go back over here, and instead of saying orange, I'm going to paste, and then it gives me this color. And I think that that's probably a good start. Now you might look at that and go, whoa, that is super bright, right? Well, the contrast is not good, you're right, if you're thinking that. And so what you would immediately want to do is start to adjust some other features about it. For instance, you could give it a text shadow. So let's take a look at that. And we can say text dash shadow. And it pops up like this. And the way that a text shadow works, and if you want, you can always go back to refer, like on W3 Schools or something, you can always come back up here and do a search for text shadow, and it will help you understand the properties. And you just want to make sure that you're finding the right hit. Don't just hit an ad up here where it says text shadow property at the w3schools.com site. You would click on that actually. And then it takes you here, and you can actually learn a little bit more about text shadow and all the different browsers that support it. This is a really great website, by the way, but just so you have an understanding, this is the order in which you're going to have to put the shadow. So you've got, these are the values. It's got 4 positions. This is one of these things that ends up being like a shorthand looking thing, but you have to do it in this kind of way. So you would do the horizontal shadow, all right? So is it going to fall to the left or right? Then the vertical shadow, all right, what's the offset for the vertical shadow? The blur radius, so how much does it blur? And the color, all right? So let's go back here and take a look, and we can kind of play around with this. So the first thing that we want to do is the horizontal. Now if I put 0, that is going to be like it has light coming directly down, straight down at 90 degrees, so that it doesn't skew the shadow to the left or right. I could do it that way, or we could do something like 2 pixels. And the reason, by the way, I didn't mention this before in the last video, but if you put 0, you don't have to put a unit of measure next to it like pixels or m or percent, because 0 is 0 is 0, right? But 2m is very different than 2% versus 2 pixels and so on. So we need to say like 2 pixels, and then that's the horizontal shadow. And then the next one would be the vertical shadow. Let's just say 2 pixels again. And then you can start to see that it's offsetting. And the first thing you'll notice is, wait, okay, my goodness, it's orange, right? I don't want an orange shadow. So if you want to start to see a little bit better of what it's looking like, you could do something like, let's go ahead and type the word black. And then you can start to see the shadow better. But we need to go back first. Here, let's go ahead and terminate it. And you'll notice that we're missing that blur radius. If you want it to have a blur on it, then this is the 3rd position that you would be able to type right here. And let's say that, let's just try like 10 pixels and see what that would do. And that's how much it would blur it. And that's just using solid black. Now, something else that you can do is, instead of using solid black, you can do what's called RGBA, and then you would put in parentheses the values. RGBA is red, green, blue, alpha. Alpha is transparency. So you'll have 4 positions in here. You would have, if you wanted black or some alpha transparency version of black, you would have 0, comma, 0, comma, 0, comma, and then this would be the percentage of the transparency. Let's say that we want it to be 100% and equivalent to what we had before. You would type 1 for 100%, and then it becomes full opacity for that black color. That's the exact same as typing what we had before. I'm just going to cut that really quick and just type the word black, and you'll see that it looks exactly the same. All right, but I'm going to go ahead and paste that RGB value there again. Now this last position, all right, and by the way, 0, because red, green, and blue channels of color work in levels. It goes, each channel has up to 256 different levels of light. 0 counts as one of the levels, so it goes from 0 to 255. If I were to type 255 in this first position, then it's going to be red, because that means that we have 100% of the red channel, but 0 light coming out of the green and 0 light coming out of the blue. All right, well, I don't think I really care for that so much. All right, so I'm going to undo that, and this is what it would look like if we had the maximum of green. That doesn't work so well. Here's what we do with the maximum of blue. Again, that doesn't work so well, but blue is actually something that we're picking up from the color of this actual image, right? There's a lot of blue in this image, and so we could look at that and think, well, okay, we want it to be really dark, maybe a really dark blue, so maybe it'll be closer to 0, that's black, but maybe instead we'll give it like 30, like a level of 30, and it starts to give it a little bit of color. or maybe we'll do like a level of 50. And you start to see that that shadow is less aggressive, it's less dominantly black, right? And then you could also change this like to a percentage. You could say 0.9. So a decimal, then it becomes slightly transparent. It becomes 10% transparent, and it becomes a little bit softer, right? And it helps us read that a lot better. Now here's the really cool thing. All right, this is really interesting. When it comes to shadows, you can actually have multiple text shadows on one thing. And the way you do it, I'm just going to copy this whole set of values right here. I just copied that. And the way you do it is you just put a comma at the end of those, and then I'm going to paste it again. And now it's like doubly strong, right? Because it's applying it twice. All right, well, I don't want that same shadow. One of the things that I could do is maybe I want sort of like a fluffy white glow around it, kind of like the clouds are, behind the other shadow. So I could do something, for instance, like instead of two pixels offset in each direction, let's say that we want 0 and then 0, right? And then instead of 10 pixels, let's see if we could blur it out like 35, and you see it becomes like a really like a glow. Well, I don't want it to be dark because then it starts to make the sky look dirty, right? So instead, let's make this RGB value, let's make it like, I don't know, 255, 255, and 255. That is the same as saying pure white, right? Now, you might look at that and go, I don't really see it. It's there. I guarantee it's there. If we got rid of it, you would notice. Okay, and if we, let's say if we took this whole thing, let's copy it and let's paste it again, you really start to see the glow coming out even more. All right, and maybe 9% is a little heavy. Maybe we want it to be 5% and 5% or something like that. And then you might look at that and go, well, hang on just a second. Isn't 5 and 5, doesn't that equal 1? And it does. So what you could also try is you could get rid of this. Let's cut that out. And then in here, you could just say 1. All right, that's another option. And then you end up having this kind of glow that is in between, and it kind of like exaggerates the darker shadow without making it like really, really dark. And I think that that's probably going to be okay to get started. All right, and that makes it so that this is easy to read, right? Be good to yourself. It's easy to read. It pops a little bit. It has a lot of brightness, and it's still good, right? Now, the other thing that I kind of don't like that it's doing is I don't necessarily want it to always be on one line. I kind of like that. I kind of like the way that it looks when it's like that, when it's stacked. And so what I think I would want to do is limit the width of that. And so right now, because callout is assigned to a paragraph tag, if you remember from lectures, paragraph tag is a block level element. That means it's going to naturally want to take up its entire block before it wraps. And so that means that if it's taking up the full block, it's taking up 100%. Right? So if you wanted to, and then you see right here, as soon as this period at the end hits the edge, it's gonna boom, it wraps. Okay, I kind of like the way that it looks wrapped though. So what I can do is I can come down into callout and I can say that I want to limit the width. Let's just say we want the width to always be set to 60%, so that no matter what, it basically, unless it's on a really big screen, right? No matter what, once it gets to about there, it's okay if it goes to a single line, but I like to keep it wrapped a little bit longer. And then, then it does this. I think that also actually looks good whenever you start getting to a narrow screen. Okay. All right. And so those are some techniques that you can do just to get that call out set up. Now what we need to do is start dealing with the rest of this text.